Hello. We are about to read the last section of part 1 of Echo by Pam Munoz Ryan. So, let's take a deep breath in and exhale. And let's begin. Chapter 20. Frederick passed the weekend in a state of numbness and anxiety. He and Uncle Gunter had hoped Father would be questioned and released the next day or the following. When he wasn't, they mulled the same questions over and over. Was Father being detained in town? Or had he been taken far away? Would he be released or held indefinitely? Was he safe or... Early Monday morning before work, Frederick and Uncle Gunter went to check the house. Frederick couldn't help but wish they'd find Father sitting in the kitchen sorting sheet music. Mrs. von Gerber was sweeping her front steps when they arrived. She nodded to them. "Frederick, I saw soldiers take your father the other night. Is there any news?" Frederick shook his head. He wished he knew for certain if Mrs. von Gerber was concerned or just fishing for gossip. "It's unfortunate that the government thinks Mr. Schmidt is their enemy," said Uncle Gunter. "He's just a temperamental musician." "He's always been that way," said Mrs. von Gerber, "prone to emotional outbursts. Elizabeth is certainly a credit to the family and the new government." She raised her chin toward the Nazi flag in her window. "I intend to follow her example. I don't want any trouble." Her eyes darted up and down the street. She gave one final push of her broom and disappeared inside her house. Frederick gazed at the flag. "Mrs. von Gerber?" Uncle Gunter tugged on Frederick's arm. "Do not believe everything you see. Come, let's check inside." When Frederick and Uncle Gunter reached the door, they noticed the jamb was splintered. They exchanged a worried look before they slowly entered. Photographs that had hung on the wall were askew, and coats and hats lay in a heap on the floor beneath the hall tree. The cuckoo held court unscathed. "Maybe it isn't so bad," said Frederick. Uncle Gunter stood in the doorway to the parlor, his face telling another story. Frederick stepped forward, and his eyes widened. The room was in shambles. Furniture had been tipped. Old cello bows had been cracked in half. Sheet music was scattered. Books lay strewn on the floor. Only Mein Kampf by Adolf Hitler was left standing face out on the shelf. Frederick and Uncle Gunter walked through the house. Every room had been searched and turned upside down. Every drawer and closet had been pillaged, except Elizabeth's room. The poster of the Nazi girl and boy in their uniforms had been left untouched. "Frederick, I want you to go to work. Tell Ernst I wasn't feeling well, but we'll be back tomorrow. Say nothing about the break-in. Do you understand?" "I want to stay with you," said Frederick. Uncle Gunter shook his head. "I'm going to get answers if I can, but in secret. I have a friend that I can trust who works with the local police. He owes me a favor. I'll ask him to inquire at the commandant's headquarters on our behalf. I need you to go to the factory and act as if all is well. I'll meet you at home tonight." News of Father's arrest traveled fast. When Frederick walked onto the factory floor, he felt more self-conscious than he ever had from his birthmark. It seemed everyone's eyes searched him out, eyes full of worry or piercing gazes of superiority that said Father should have known better, and that all too familiar look of pity that word this time for something other than his face. He kept his head down, hurried to his station, and set to work. When Ernst made his rounds, Frederick told him that Uncle Gunter wasn't feeling well, but would be back tomorrow. Ernst nodded. I was deeply sorry, Frederick, to hear about Martin. His voice was so sincere that Frederick couldn't look up for fear he'd cry. When Anselm came to deliver harmonicas, he was as puffed up as a rooster. Guess you'll think twice the next time you turn me down for a meeting. Right, Frederick? Frederick refused to meet his gaze and kept working. Anselm leaned in. There's another youth rally next month for winter solstice. You'll come with me this time. We don't want the same thing to happen to your uncle that happened to your father. Do we, Frederick? He sauntered away whistling. Anselm's threat burned inside of him. Frederick gritted his teeth to keep from saying something he'd regret. Chapter 21. After work, Frederick found Uncle Gunter waiting for him at the kitchen table in the apartment. Frederick pulled out a chair and sat next to him, searching his troubled face. The news is not good, is it? Uncle Gunter shook his head. He was taken to Dachau on a train with a group of other political prisoners. He's confined there. Dachau. Work will set you free. Frederick shuddered. The hard labor prison? Yes, said Uncle Gunter. For how long? Whispered Frederick. I don't know. I want to see some friends who have a family member there. People have been given sentences of as little as a month and as much as several years. It depends on how long the Nazis think it will take to re-educate the prisoners to the Nazi way of thinking. Frederick swiped at his tears. But can't a prisoner just say he's re-educated? They have ways of knowing if the person is sincere, said Uncle Gunter. Nazis put spies inside the camp posing as other prisoners. They read their mail and watch their families, hoping to round up more dissenters. Will they try and round you up? Uncle Gunter put a hand on his arm. Maybe. But let's worry about your father right now. There's a way we might shorten his sentence. Frederick leaned in. How? Uncle Gunter looked around as if someone might be listening. Once a prisoner has been there a month, a family member may bring a sizable ransom to the commandant at Dachau. Then the prisoner will be released on probation. A ransom? Frederick brightened. I have money from my earnings. I was going to use it for books at the conservatory, but he shrugged. Would he ever go to the conservatory now, anyway? And for father, he would do anything. It's as much as 3 months' worth of my regular pay. I have double your amount, I can add, said Uncle Gunter, but it still is not enough. What about Elizabeth? Elizabeth? No, said Frederick. It would be just what she'd want to hear, that father hadn't listened to her advice and was now in trouble. And wouldn't she delight in lecturing Frederick? Frederick, please reconsider, said Uncle Gunter. You could write her and tell her what she wants to hear, that Martin and I are eager to join the Nazi Party, that you will join Hitler Youth, and that you need help for your father's sake to bring him back into Germany's arms. Part of it would be a ruse, but what difference would it make if it saves Martin's life, and if she were the one to deliver the money, the family's shining example, they would surely let him go. Couldn't we ask Marguerite's parents? Uncle Gunter shook his head. Your father has never trusted them, and this ransom is not exactly officially permitted. It's illegal? Frederick shook his head. Then Elizabeth will want nothing to do with it. Don't be so sure. He's her father, too. She has a right to know where he is and what he's facing, said Uncle Gunter. And you won't be asking for a ransom. You'll be asking for assistance with a re-education stipend. Besides, there's no one else who might help. If you won't write her, I'll do it myself. But it will be better coming from you. What will it hurt to ask? Frederick took a deep breath, closing his eyes for a moment. He knew the answer. Only my pride. It has worked for others, and the sooner we get him out, the better. They work them until... I can't let that happen to my brother. Uncle Gunter rubbed at his damp eyes. Frederick, until we can get your father away from there, we must appear loyal. Tomorrow I will register for the party and get 2 Nazi flags, one for your house and one for mine. That should keep me from an interview any time soon. Frederick sighed. And tonight I will write to Elizabeth, the loyal Hitlerite. Chapter 22. Trossingen prepared for the holidays, but Frederick's heart was joyless and sick with worry. Father had been in Dachau for over a month, and still Frederick hadn't heard from Elizabeth, nor had Father answered one of Frederick's or Uncle Gunter's letters. Was he ill? Was he warm enough? Had he enough to eat? Was he alive? Uncle Gunter nodded to the dinner. You barely sleep. You pick at your food. Your work at the factory has slowed. I haven't heard a sound from your harmonica in weeks. Eat, Frederick. You need to stay strong. Just as Frederick raised his fork, there was a series of quick knocks at the door. His heart sped up. Was it stormtroopers again? He followed Uncle Gunter to the door, clutching his arm. But this time it was Mrs. von Gerber, in a long wool coat, holding a shopping basket. Please, come in, said Uncle Gunter. She stepped inside. I won't stay. I am delivering a package to Frederick. It came to my house inside a box addressed to me. That dear Elizabeth remembered to send me several jars of quince jam, and she had it hand-delivered by a friend. Her note said she didn't want to send it through the post because the jars are fragile, and she asked if I could give you this without any delay. From beneath the groceries, Mrs. von Gerber pulled a fat, square package wrapped in brown paper and tied with a string. She handed it to Frederick. She asked for my discretion in the matter. Thank you, said Frederick. She nodded to Uncle Gunter and lowered her voice. They canvass the house every day. Soldiers came again yesterday and questioned the neighbors. They asked about you, your dispositions, your feelings about Jews. I told them I only knew you as Elizabeth and Frederick's kindly uncle. Nothing more. After they left, they stood on my steps smoking. I couldn't help but hear. One said, question him on Wednesday with the others, and if he's not believable, put him in with his brother. Uncle Gunter took Mrs. von Gerber's hand. You're very kind. She pulled away. I'll be going. I must visit a friend on the next floor. She's my excuse for being in the building. She quickly slipped out the door and was gone. Uncle Gunter locked the door behind her and pulled the shades. Uncle, they're going to question you. It is nothing we didn't suspect. Besides, I'll be believable. I know what to say to please them. Now, let's see what Elizabeth has sent. He nodded toward the package. Frederick sat down at the table. With a knife, he carefully cut the string and unwrapped the brown paper. An envelope lay on the lid of the square tin. He took a deep breath before he opened it, unfolded the letter, and began to read. Dear Frederick, thank you for your recent correspondence. I wish you a happy winter solstice instead of a Merry Christmas, even if you still celebrate Christmas, it is recommended that people not put stars on top of their trees. A 6-pointed star is a Jewish symbol, and a 5-pointed star is a communist symbol, both of which do not align with Nazi ideology. Stars of any type are not appropriate. My work goes well. He scanned the rest. It was about her league work and her hope that Frederick would join the Hitler Youth. He opened the box and unfolded the paper. Cookies shaped like swastikas? Is this all she can think about? He shoved his chair backward, tossed the letter on the table, and began to pace around the kitchen. I wrote her that Father's in Dachau. I asked her to help me, and all she talks about is stars. She doesn't even ask about him. Tears welled in his eyes. Uncle Gunter picked up the letter and began to read it. Frederick, what does the postscript mean? I hope you enjoy the cookies. I made them myself, especially for you and Uncle. Don't eat them all at once, as you've tried to do before, especially since I won't be there to hide them from you. Frederick threw his hands in the air, trying to remember. When I was little, I ate an entire plate of cookies. She was so angry she hid the next batch in the bread box under the crumb tray. Uncle Gunter raised his eyebrows. He leaned over the tin, carefully lifted the cookies out on a table at a time, layer by layer. When the box was empty, he picked up a knife, put the point beneath the base, and pried. A false bottom popped up. Frederick sucked in his breath. Underneath were stacks of Reich marks. Wide-eyed Frederick carefully picked them up, fanned them out, and laid them on the table. Is this enough? Uncle Gunter nodded. It is plenty. And it was a great risk for her to send them. If Mrs. von Gerber hadn't been trustworthy, Elizabeth could be the one to be questioned next. I think we can assume she won't be our emissary. We should carry the money in the box as she sent it. It is a good ploy. And patriotic, too. We still need to figure out how to deliver it. Let us sleep on it and talk again in the morning. Uncle Gunter smiled. Elizabeth may not be the Nazi she seems, nor Mrs. von Gerber for that matter. After Uncle Gunter went to bed, Frederick sat in the small kitchen looking at Reich marks. He pulled the harmonica from his pocket and began to play O Tannenbaum, O Christmas Tree. He closed his eyes and was swept back in time. Elizabeth was at the piano in the parlor, playing and singing. She was 12 years old. Her fingers danced over the keys, and her head swayed in the music. Frederick could still remember feeling transfixed. When she noticed him, she stopped and patted the bench so that he might climb next to her. She began again, and together they sang, O Christmas tree, how lovely are thy branches. They're green when summer days are bright. They're green when winter snow is white. O Christmas tree, how lovely are thy branches. When they had finished singing, they turned to each other and laughed. Elizabeth impulsively took his face in her hands and kissed his cheek. No matter what she said in recent months, she had loved him once. Did she still? He laid the harmonica on the table next to all the Reich marks. Then he gathered the paper and pen and wrote to Elizabeth, thanking her for the information about the stars. He thanked her too for the cookies and said they would go far in making their holiday more rewarding. He wrote about the smallest of his daily tasks and what he and Uncle Gunter had for dinner, and reminded her of the time she put a mustard poultice on his face to try to make his birthmark disappear. He wished her well and addressed the envelope with the endearment Elizabeth Schmidt, so she wouldn't forget the sound of his voice. Chapter 23. An hour before the first light, Frederick suddenly awoke and sat up on the cot. From the next room, he heard Uncle Gunter's gentle snoring. Even before he'd fallen asleep last night, an idea had begun to knit in his mind. Now the prospect was fully formed. He laid down again and went over all that would need to happen and in which order. He found his hands in the air, conducting. He threw off his blanket. He needed to convince Uncle Gunter. "I don't like it, Frederick. I don't like it at all." Uncle Gunter sat on the edge of his bed in his overalls and pulled on his work boots. "Let's eat a piece of bread and get to the factory," he added. He headed into the kitchen. Frederick followed and tried to reason with him. "Uncle, even if Elizabeth had offered to be our messenger, which she did not, she's in Berlin, in the north, 12 or more hours by train. Dachau is only half the time from here, and it is east. It makes sense for it to be me. Besides, they are watching you. You must leave, just as we planned before Father was taken." "I promised your father I would not. If you are arrested, you will have to leave me anyway. You heard Mrs. von Gerber. They will question you on Wednesday. How many people do they question and just let go? They will take you. And then what will be of me? Frederick, if I just disappear before they come to question me, it will take only one telephone call to block any attempts on your part to release your father from Dachau." "Not if I've already gone there." Frederick took a deep breath. "I have a plan. Today is Friday. When we get to work, you must think of something to tell Ernst as to why you will not be in on Monday. Then, tonight, after dark, you will leave for Bern. That will give you 3 days to reach there. Walking the back roads at night and sleeping during the day, just like we'd originally planned before Father was taken. It's the weekend. No one will be the wiser. I'll go to work on Monday and leave at lunchtime, making an excuse to Mr. Eichmann about not reading to him that day. Then, I'll take the afternoon train and deliver the ransom first thing Tuesday morning." Uncle Gunter raised an eyebrow. "And when you and I don't show up for work on Tuesday morning?" "They'll send someone here eventually," said Frederick, sweeping his hand around the room. "I have that worked out too. When they arrive, they'll presume to know what happened to us. But they'll be wrong." Uncle Gunter sliced a piece of bread for both of them, as Frederick continued explaining. Uncle Gunter blew out a deep breath and rubbed his chin. It's clever." "You must leave tonight." Uncle Gunter went to the tiny window over the basin and stared out. "But think of all that could go wrong. We don't know Martin's condition. What if he's not well enough to travel?" He held up a finger. "Wait. I have a friend we can trust who is a doctor in Munich. If your father needs medical help, you can go to him." Frederick smiled. "You can give me his information." Yes, that is a possibility." He turned to Frederick. "You can take nothing of sentiment or value, or it will be confiscated by the Nazis, except for the Reichmarks, of course. It's good that it's the holidays. Many people will be traveling and will be preoccupied. I suspect the Commandant at Dachau will feel more amenable right before Christmas, too." Uncle Gunter looked at him. The seriousness and risk of what they were about to do filled the room. "Frederick, you understand that once we leave, there's no coming back." "Yes, Uncle, I understand." "Nephew, from where have you found your conviction?" "From Father and you." "And even from Elizabeth. If she can jeopardize everything important in her life to save Father, shouldn't I?" Uncle Gunter nodded. "Well, here is what I will tell Ernst when I get back to work this morning. I've been nursing a toothache for days. I called a dentist, but the first appointment I can get is Monday, and I suspect it needs to be pulled, so I'll have to miss a day of work. Frederick smiled. And I will tell Mr. Eichmann I can't read to him on Monday afternoon because I need to help you home from the dentist. Uncle Gunter took a deep breath, his face wrenched with worry. Frederick instinctively patted the pocket that held his harmonica. We can do it, Uncle. 1 foot in front of the other. Chapter 24. That evening, after dark had settled, Uncle Gunter stood near his door, bundled for a night in the cold. He wrapped a heavy wool scarf around his neck and pulled on a knit cap. He put on gloves, his eyes sweeping the small apartment. Make it look as if it really happened. Frederick nodded. I will. And remember what we've discussed. Uncle, we've gone over it dozens of times. I know. I'm proud of you, Frederick, and so will your father be. He pulled Frederick close one last time and hugged him. Don't forget, who is your real uncle who taught you how to ride the bicycle? You. And to play the harmonica? Frederick laughed, fighting back tears. You, I won't forget. With luck, I'll see you in a week. Be safe. Uncle Gunter picked up his bag, stepped out the door, and pulled it shut behind him. I'll try, whispered Frederick. Frederick woke on Saturday morning shivering. He built the fire, pulled the cot closer to the hearth, and watched the flames leap. He realized that for the first time in his life he was alone. Not only that, he held the fate of his family in his hands. If he could not complete the undertaking, what might happen to them all? The reality of what he was soon to do came crashing down upon him. He'd have to buy tickets, take trains, and sit across from strangers. He'd have to suffer the stares of clerks, porters, conductors, and people he'd never met. He held out his hands toward the hearth to warm them, his mind reviewing what he and Uncle Gunter had discussed. He would take the train to Stuttgart and transfer to Munich, but he mustn't draw undue attention to himself. The money was a concern. He couldn't lose it or let it fall into the wrong hands. When he reached Munich, he would walk to Dachau. Before the main gate, he would find the administration building and ask to speak to the commandant about his father, Martin Schmidt. He must be humble and polite, and appear sincere. He must not take anything with him that was of sentiment or value, because his bag would be searched and anything desirable would be confiscated. If the guards or the commandant asked about his birthmark, he would tell them he was volunteering to have the surgery to prove his loyalty to the fatherland. He would lie. He practiced what he would say when he delivered the ransom. My father is ready to receive. My family is ready to receive my father back into the world of Hitler's Germany to embrace the Nazi ideals. And, as a sign of good faith and respect, I have brought a package of delicacies for the commandant. The words rolled around in his mouth like marbles, hard and slick, making him wish he could spit them out. But he repeated them again and again. Chapter 25. On Sunday evening, Frederick packed a small satchel and put it by the door. He set the dinner table for 2, filling both plates and eating off both of them. Then he strewed a stack of newspapers around the room. He opened cupboards, took out plates, and broke them, muffling the sound beneath tea towels, silently and methodically, so as not to alert the neighbors yet. He tipped over lamps and chairs, rifled through old mail, and tossed clothing from drawers. He left the remnants of dinner on the table as if he and Uncle Gunter had been interrupted mid-meal. After dark, he took a screwdriver and, from the hallway, quietly splintered the door jamb. Then he did his mathematics homework. When the stage was set, he sat on the cot, lifted the harmonica, and played a good-night concert, soothed by the beauty of the music and the lyrics in his mind. Lullaby and good night with pink roses bedight. He swayed as if cradling Trossingen and its half-timbered houses. He played for the tall stone building, the conservatory, and the notes that sprinkled down in a shower, washing his face clean. He played for the factory with its cobblestone square, the huddled buildings, and the fat water tower that had kept him safe. He bid his greedy lunchmates adieu, along with the graveyard room, where most men wouldn't dare to go alone, and the A-frame ladder with the perch from where he imagined directing a percussive symphony of machinery. He said good night to Mrs. Steinweg, Mr. Karl, Mr. Eichmann, and Mr. Adler, and Mr. Engel, who were still arguing about which of them was the most suited to teach him secondary history. He played for his house, the kitchen with the walnut hutch, his mother's collection of plates, the tin canisters that sat in descending order, the green shutters, the parlor that smelled of bow rosin, and father's anise lozenges, his bedroom that still looked the same the way he liked it, and Elizabeth's room, the oil painting of a field of flowers above her bed back where it belonged. With lilies o'erspread is my baby's wee bed. Lay thee down now and rest, may thy slumber be blessed. And he played for the cuckoo, resting and waiting behind its tiny door for the quarter hour. May thy slumber be blessed. He lay down fully dressed on the cot he would upturn in the morning, and pulled a blanket over himself. Good night, he whispered. Chapter 26. At the factory, Frederick tried to act as if it was any other Monday morning. He pretended that carrying a satchel with a coat draped over it was usual, and that hiding the satchel in the cupboard at his workspace, knowing that hundreds of Reichmarks were inches from his feet, was an everyday occurrence. He was nonchalant as he sent an apprentice to tell Mr. Eichmann that he couldn't read to him that afternoon because Uncle Gunter needed his help getting home from the dentist. When Mr. Karl came by, Frederick handed over his mathematics homework, but begged off reviewing it with him until tomorrow for the same reason. He had to leave early today. He kept his head down, inspecting and polishing, until he caught sight of Anselm coming toward him with a box of harmonicas. Frederick, the winter solstice rallies Thursday. We can go together from work at 2 o'clock. I'd hate for you to decline again. I'll go, said Frederick, forcing a smile. Of course you will. You won't be disappointed. And I'll have fulfilled my promise to your sister. I am sure when she hears she'll be surprised that I was able to convince you, but I can be persuasive, right? Frederick nodded and turned his back to work. Right. For the rest of the morning he watched the clock. Finally, he pulled the harmonica from his pocket and spent far more time polishing it than needed. He had meant to send it with Uncle Gunter, but his mind, consumed by the plan, he had forgotten. Now Uncle Gunter's words played in his head. You can take nothing of sentiment or value, or it will be confiscated by the Nazis. Frederick looked around to see if anyone was watching, and then, one last time, he blew into the harmonica that had filled him with such confidence and determination. The chord sounded hopeful. He massaged the M on the side, tucked it into a box, and felt a pang as he put on the lid. He nestled the box in a slim case with a dozen others that would soon be packed into a crate, carted to an electric train, pulled by a steam engine to a cargo ship, and ferried from Germany across the ocean and out into the world. "Guten Reise, old friend," Frederick whispered, wondering who might play it next, and whether it would bring that person as much joy and comfort as it had brought him. The lunch whistle blew. Frederick let the most of the men flood off the factory floor before he grabbed the satchel from the cupboard, draped it with his coat again, and walked from the building. A light snow fell. When Frederick exhaled, the cold air made cloudy puffs in front of him. Once beyond the factory gates, he stopped to put on his coat. His hand shook. Was he nervous or cold? He pulled a knit cap below his ears and wrapped a wool scarf around his neck so that only a sliver of his face was exposed. He picked up the satchel and hurried to the train station. He purchased a ticket. There were a few passengers waiting this time of day. He sat on a bench beneath an overhang, watching the snow fall. He heard the swish of a broom as a clerk pushed snow from the platform. The giggling of two young women on the bench next to him. The clacking of the cart the porter pushed over the wooden planks. Frederick stuffed his hands under his legs to keep from conducting. The train arrived on schedule and stopped in a blast of steam. He climbed aboard and sat, pressed to a window. From the car ahead, two soldiers emerged. "Papers. This is an inspection. All passengers, present your papers." Frederick's heart pounded. He recognized the voices. They belonged to the same soldiers who had come to his house and taken his father. The same soldier who thought Frederick was ugly and offensive. They had been the ones who ransacked his house too. Would they make trouble for him now? Passenger by passenger, Eiffel and Faber worked their way down the aisle until Faber stood next to him. "Your papers." Frederick's hand trembled as he pulled his identification from his pocket and handed it to him. "Your purpose for travel?" "To see relatives for the holiday." Faber glanced at his papers and handed them back. "You are cleared. Move on." Relief flooded through Frederick until Eiffel stopped in front of him. "Wait." Faber turned his back. Eiffel leaned across the street and pulled Frederick's cap and scarf from his face. "Well, well, well," said Eiffel. "Who do we have here? It is the ugly son of a Jew lover. I always say, like father, like son." Frederick hugged his satchel tighter. His eyes darted from one man to the other, fear rising in his throat. Faber stood straighter. "Frederick Schmidt, hand over your bag and step into the aisle for inspection in the name of Adolf Hitler on the Third Reich." Frederick's breathing became quick and shallow. Was his journey ending before it had even begun? The steam engine started chuffing. He inched slowly across the street and stood in the aisle. A burst of wind hit the train, and a snow flurry descended. All eyes shifted to the outside. Enormous snowflakes swirled, pirouetting like dancers in Tchaikovsky's ballet. Frederick heard the Sleeping Beauty waltz, played by a symphony orchestra. Strings, winds, brass, percussion, 100 instruments strong, and in that moment, something mysterious took hold of him. Whether it was an instinct to delay or an impulse to distract the soldiers or something else. Frederick could not say, but he was unable to control his hands. He dropped the satchel and began to conduct. Faber gave a disgusted look, grabbed the satchel and rummaged through it. "Stop that nonsense!" yelled Eiffel as he struggled to search Frederick's pockets. "You will soon see the inside of a cell, you lunatic." even as Eiffel and Faber grabbed him by the scruff of the neck and marched him toward the train door. Frederick imagined only snowy ballerinas, tiny purse-white stars twirling and leaping to hypnotic music. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. And that is the end of part 1 of Echo.